Hey folks, tonight we're diving into something utterly captivating, the wild world of mental health in medieval times. Imagine feeling anxious, depressed, or just off. What did that even mean back then? Well, let's just say therapy wasn't exactly covered by the local blacksmith's guild. Before you get cozy, hit that like button and subscribe if you're into what I do here. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always a trip seeing how far this channel reaches. Now, dim those lights, maybe crank up a fan for some white noise, and let's drift into tonight's journey together. First, the basics. In medieval Europe, your mental state, your moods, energy, thoughts, even your tendency to sob over ruined breakfast, was believed to be ruled by a funky cocktail of bodily fluids. And no, this wasn't metaphorical. We're talking literal juices sloshing around inside you. Yes, someone probably tried to measure them. This bizarre system came courtesy of the Greeks, specifically Hippocrates and Galen, and it stuck around way longer than it had any right to. The four humors theory claimed your health, personality, and emotions were all dictated by the balance of blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Each fluid came with its own personality profile. Too much blood? You were cheerful and energetic until you became insufferable, and they drained you with leeches. Excess yellow bile? You were angry and impulsive, great for battle, terrible for dinner parties. Black bile? That was the melancholy juice, what we'd now call depression, but back then was just a mood imbalance caused by too much thinking and not enough sunlight. Phlegm? That was for the sluggish, the calm, the maybe he's just tired crowd. So if you were sad, you didn't need a therapist, you needed a bucket and a guy with a knife. The go-to cure for emotional distress? Bloodletting, a delightful procedure where someone opened a vein and crossed their fingers that you'd feel better before you passed out. If that didn't work, you might get prescribed laxatives, because obviously, when your soul hurts, it's clearly your bowel's fault. Physicians, and we're using that term loosely, would diagnose you by asking profound questions like, do you feel moist or dry today? They might inspect your urine, consult the stars, or sniff your breath. The conclusion? Always the humors. You were either too hot, too cold, too wet, too dry, or just too difficult to fix without divine intervention. Remember, these weren't fringe beliefs. This was mainstream medicine for centuries. So next time you picture a medieval person having a panic attack, don't imagine a friend offering tea. Picture a robed man with a fluid chart and a very sharp knife saying, let's drain the sad out. In medieval Europe, if you felt off emotionally, mentally, spiritually, and couldn't blame it on sin, demons, or your neighbor's questionable baking, there was another prime suspect, the moon. Yep, that glowing orb in the sky was thought to directly mess with your brain. The term lunatic didn't come from nowhere. It's from luna, the Latin word for moon. People genuinely believed too much moonlight could scramble your mind like an undercooked egg. This wasn't just peasant superstition. Doctors, clergy, and that guy screaming by the well all agreed. The idea was that the moon, being a celestial busybody, could disrupt your bodily fluids, especially the brain juices, which were assumed to slosh around your skull like sad soup during a full moon. Folks who acted strange around a full moon weren't seen as stressed or neurodivergent. They were just moonstruck. Some were locked up until the lunar cycle passed, because medieval healthcare's answer to everything was waited out. The moon also got blamed for epilepsy, insomnia, hallucinations, and anything else that couldn't be fixed with soup, leeches, or prayer. If you were up at night pacing or crying, no one asked about your childhood. They asked about the sky. Even animals weren't safe. Farmers swore sheep got skittish and dogs howled differently under a full moon. If your ox kicked over a cart, someone would mutter, the moon's up to something. Of course, there was zero science to back this up, but then again, there wasn't much science, period. Medical texts referenced astrology as casually as we cite caffeine, and treatments often involved herbs, diet changes, and planetary alignments. Because sometimes it wasn't madness, just bad moon energy. If your mental health took a nosedive, say, you started weeping into your bread, yelling at trees, or speaking in rhymes, the first person you'd consult wasn't a doctor. It was the local priest. Why? Because in the Middle Ages, the mind was seen as a spiritual battleground, and any weird behavior was filtered through theology. Depression? Maybe you'd sinned and forgotten. Anxiety? A sign the devil was cozying up in your soul. Hearing voices? Classic demonic Airbnb situation. Priests were the default mental health professionals, except instead of therapy, they offered confession, fasting, and a stern reminder that you were made of dust and should act like it. If you showed signs of what we'd now call mental illness, the priest would perform a moral diagnosis. Were you skipping church? Coveting your neighbor's spouse? Laughing too much? Yes, that was suspicious. If so, your condition didn't need herbs. It needed repentance. For extreme cases, hallucinations, nudism, erratic behavior, the church had bigger guns, prayer vigils, pilgrimages, and, in special cases, minor exorcisms. Just to rule out demonic possession. Can't be too careful. Even everyday emotions were suspect. Too much joy? Vanity. Deep sadness? Sloth of the soul, aka astia, basically spiritual depression, treated with psalms and guilt. If you were melancholic, you weren't struggling, you were morally slippery and not trying hard enough. The irony? Many people found comfort in the church's explanations. In a world without neuroscience, the idea that suffering had cosmic meaning was weirdly reassuring. It gave chaos structure, even if the treatment was mostly chanting. Still, if you had mental health issues in the Middle Ages, your best hope wasn't compassion. It was a priest with decent bedside manner and a quick trigger for demon accusations. So you've been hearing voices, having visions, or just talking to your soup a little too intimately. Today, you'd get therapy or a wellness podcast. In the Middle Ages, you got an exorcism. Yep, the go-to treatment for mental disturbances wasn't meds or rest. It was a full-blown spiritual eviction. The logic was simple. If you acted weird, it wasn't trauma or stress. It was Beelzebub squatting behind your eyeballs rent-free. Exorcisms came in two flavors. Minor, basically an intense prayer circle with holy water and muttering. Major, a live performance starring one terrified patient, a robed priest, and a backup choir of monks humming in Latin. The rituals varied but always included chanting, scripture, cross signs, relics, and occasionally yelling, "Depart, foul spirit," directly into your face. If you flinched, proof it was working. If you didn't, they'd just chant louder. Some records describe tying people down, sprinkling salt on them, or forcing them to drink holy water. Others fasted for days beforehand, which, let's be honest, could make anyone act strange. One poor soul allegedly had demons smoked out of his ears using burning sage and frankincense, and what we can only assume was a deep misunderstanding of ventilation. If none of that worked, you were either deemed beyond help or written off as just naturally wicked. Not all exorcisms were terrifying, though. In villages, they were communal events, part religious ritual, part entertainment, part gossip fuel. Think of it as medieval reality TV. But most people who got exorcised weren't evil, just overwhelmed, traumatized, neurodivergent, or unlucky enough to have a panic attack near a bishop. Let's say you weren't quite disturbed enough for a full-blown exorcism, but still making everyone uncomfortable at dinner, weeping randomly, forgetting your own name, or staring at firewood like it held the secrets of the universe. In that case, your treatment wouldn't involve ropes or shouting. Just a lot of praying, possibly while locked in a room. This was known, in some circles, as the gentle approach to mental health. You'd be told your condition was spiritual in origin and could be overcome through self-reflection, discipline, and, of course, relentless repentance. Essentially, medieval mental health care boiled down to, have you tried feeling worse about it? The logic was that suffering purified the soul. So if you were already mentally suffering, clearly you were halfway to salvation. Monks and nuns, some genuinely compassionate, others just chronically overworked, might guide you through periods of meditative silence, prayer vigils, fasting, and sleeping on surfaces that felt like torture devices. The goal? Either the devil would leave, or you'd forget what happiness even was. Some people voluntarily entered monasteries as a kind of medieval wellness retreat, though retreat is generous. You got a cell, a Bible, and 8 hours of daily chanting. Occasionally, you'd also get stew. Whether this actually helped mental illness or just masked it with religious exhaustion is still debated. Then there were the relics. Feeling unwell? Touch a saint's bone fragment. Trouble sleeping? Nap near a vial of martyr's blood. Sad for no reason? That's what Saint Euphemia's toe was for. The idea was that holiness was contagious, like kindness or fleas. To be fair, this was the closest thing to compassionate care in many places. Unlike exorcisms or beatings, the prayer-based route rarely caused physical harm. It was just a lot of chanting and being told your thoughts were problematic. Sometimes, monks genuinely helped people through community, quiet routines, and structure. Other times, they'd say, fast until sunrise and hope for divine clarity. Spoiler, the clarity usually didn't come. Now, let's say your condition went beyond moody silences and occasionally philosophizing with candles. Maybe you'd started wandering barefoot through town, mumbling about angels, or having heated theological debates with livestock. At that point, the medieval response wasn't a support group. It was a stone room with one window and no doorknob on your side. Enter monastic confinement, or as historians politely call it, protective isolation. These cells were tucked inside monasteries or churches and considered an act of mercy. Emphasis on considered. You wouldn't be chained, hopefully, but you would be strongly discouraged from leaving, sometimes for years. The space was bleak. Bare walls, maybe a straw mat, and if you were lucky, a tiny window where twice daily meals of cold gruel would appear. Human contact was rare, because the working theory was that your madness was contagious, emotionally, spiritually, or just vibes-wise. You weren't entirely forgotten, though. Monks might pray for your soul. Occasionally, a kinder brother would bring herbs or recite psalms outside your door in a tone that suggested you weren't the worst thing they'd seen that week. Sometimes, these locked rooms weren't in monasteries, but in early versions of asylums, which existed in medieval Islamic cities and, by the 13th century, in places like London and Paris. The goal? Shelter, not treatment. Certainly not recovery. To their credit, the medieval mindset wasn't always cruel. Many believed the mentally unwell were closer to the divine, touched by God, or walking the line between prophecy and peculiarity. But practically, locking someone away was easier than figuring out what to do with them. Families often paid monasteries to take afflicted relatives, donating money or land in exchange. The alternative was explaining to neighbors why Uncle Thaddeus was screaming Latin in the cabbage patch again. If you were a woman in medieval Europe and found yourself overwhelmed, irritable, or weepy, say, after your 11th child or your 3rd husband with plague breath, congratulations. You were probably diagnosed with hysteria. And yes, diagnosed is doing Olympic-level heavy lifting here. Hysteria wasn't so much a diagnosis as a blanket explanation for this woman is behaving in ways that unsettle men. Crying too much? Hysteria. Not crying enough? Suspicious, possibly witchcraft. Expressing opinions, ambition, or exhaustion. Clearly a wandering womb issue. The term comes from the Greek hysterouterus. The theory? A woman's uterus could detach and roam her body like a moody ghost, causing trouble wherever it lodged. Shortness of breath? Nervousness? Fainting? Too much thought? All blamed on the uterus's emotional road trip. Treatments ranged from priests, fast and pray. Physicians, here, smell these herbs. Midwives, awkward manual stimulation to calm the uterus. Yes, really. Marriage was also considered a cure. Single? You needed a husband to settle your womb. Married? Then you just needed to be pregnant again. Either way, the prescription was more chores, less rest. And if you kept acting strangely, seeing visions, resisting housework, or thinking in Latin, things escalated. Some women were accused of witchcraft because nothing says mental illness like growing herbs and asking questions. Not all was bleak, though. Some women found solace in convents, where daily demands were lighter, and emotional distress was framed as spiritual struggle. Some nuns wrote about anguish in ways that sound eerily modern, minus the demon metaphors. Still, if you were a medieval woman with feelings, your best strategy was keep it quiet, keep it brief, and never talk to your cat in public. In an era when monks prescribed fasting, priests blamed demons, and physicians swore by draining bad blood through your ankles, the real unsung heroes of medieval mental health care were the herbalists. Usually elderly women with gardens full of suspicious plants, a clouder of cats, and unnervingly accurate intuition. These wise women, sometimes called cunning folk, were the unofficial, unlicensed therapists of their day. They didn't ask about your humoral balance. They asked when the sadness started, how you'd been sleeping, and whether your mother-in-law was being difficult again. Their methods were straightforward. tea, tinctures, and talking, though the talking part was often disguised as herbology advice. You'd sit in a smoke-filled cottage surrounded by drying plants, and before long, you'd be sipping valerian roots steeped in wine while ranting about your neighbor's destructive pig. It was like therapy, except it also allegedly cured warts. Herbalists treated sadness with calming infusions of lavender and rose, anxiety with chamomile and lemon balm, acute distress with mugwort, St. John's wort, or, in dire cases, a heavy dose of poppy extract, aka medieval Xanax, billed as a sleep aid, but more like accidental time travel. Most of these women had no formal education, but their remedies were rooted in generations of observation, trial and error, and something modern medicine now calls listening to the damn patient, which, ironically, made them threatening to the establishment. The church viewed them as rivals. They operated outside religious doctrine. Townsfolk alternated between relying on them and accusing them of witchcraft if they became too popular, too effective, or, heaven forbid, too confident in public. Still, for many suffering what we'd now call depression, trauma, or burnout, the village herbalist was the only source of comfort. Were their remedies foolproof? Absolutely not. Sometimes they rubbed onions on your feet to draw out madness. But compared to being locked in a stone cell or screamed at by a monk wielding a goat's skull, the herbalist's approach was practically holistic spot treatment. So far, we've covered prayers, isolation, and herb-slinging grandmothers with zero medical licenses. But medieval mental health care had one final tier, the truly unhinged treatments that make you wonder if physicians were just improvising based on dreams and whatever they found in their pantries. Let's start with the dead owl therapy. Yes, if plagued by sadness or excessive thoughts, one prescribed remedy was to tie a dead owl to your head. The theory? Owls symbolized wisdom, so their carcasses would absorb melancholy through your scalp. In practice, they mostly absorbed flies. Feeling anxious? Try powdered emeralds. Not metaphorically, actual crushed gemstones rubbed on your chest or ingested. Not only did this not work, it was an excellent way to ruin both your digestive system and your jewelry collection. Then there were the astrology-based cures, which were less medicine and more vibe checks from the cosmos. Your mental disturbance might be blamed on Mars being in a mood, with treatment consisting of waiting until Jupiter looked friendlier. Other highlights: wrapping the sufferer in wolf skin during a thunderstorm to scare off madness, whispering sorrows into a black dog's left ear, then letting it run away with your grief, a furry, four-legged therapy courier, waving smoke-stuffed pigeons near a patient's head, purpose unclear, but very aromatic. And if none of that worked, there was always pilgrimage, the medieval cure-all. Strap on sandals, grab a staff, and walk hundreds of miles to a holy site. Either you'd find spiritual peace, or you'd be too exhausted/blistered to remember why you were sad. These treatments remind us that medieval medicine wasn't malicious, just wildly misinformed, occasionally experimental, and frequently bird-related. But hey, they gave people hope, which back then was the closest thing to Prozac. Every medieval town had that guy, the one muttering to himself, blessing chickens 1 minute and cursing puddles the next. The town madman. And strangely, society didn't always lock him up or douse him in holy water. Often, they just let him be. In an age when mental illness was feared or misunderstood, this was oddly progressive. People with visible disorders weren't necessarily banished. They were absorbed into daily life like unpredictable weather, or that one goat who thinks he owns the marketplace. The village idiot, though women were more likely to be called witches, occupied a peculiar social niche, not quite a threat, not quite a joke, sometimes even revered. Some were seen as touched by God, their ramblings interpreted as prophecy. Others got nicknames like Old Will the Wanderer or Mad Meg, which, tellingly, often doubled as pub names, hinting at how much alcohol fueled these discussions. These individuals typically lived on society's edges, sleeping in abandoned mills, church porches, or literal barrels like Diogenes. Locals might toss them bread or shoes, or just give them wide berth. Kids were told not to stare, so of course they always stared. But tolerance had limits. If someone became violent or disruptive, out came the priest in chains. Compassion often depended on whether the madman was entertaining or inconvenient. In modern times, we understand depression as a complex interplay of brain chemistry, life circumstances, and sometimes just really terrible Mondays. But in the Middle Ages, if you felt persistently low, exhausted, or like life was a slow-motion slog through mud, congratulations, you were guilty of acia. This wasn't considered a mental health condition. Oh no, it was classified as a spiritual failure, one of the original deadly sins before sloth stole its spotlight. Acia was essentially sadness at divine goodness, or more plainly, spiritual apathy, a lack of joy in God's creation, the medieval equivalent of lying in bed staring at the ceiling while your soul slowly deflated. Monks were especially prone to it, poetically dubbing it the noonday demon. Picture this: a monk, meant to be copying psalms, instead stares at a wall wondering what's the point of it all? Today we'd call that burnout or existential dread. In the 12th century, a moral crisis requiring urgent prayer and possibly more self-flagellation. Sufferers weren't offered comfort. They were told to. Pray harder, because clearly you weren't trying enough. Work more. Idle hands are the devil's playground. Stop being selfish. Your sadness is an insult to God's gifts. Depression wasn't an illness. It was laziness with better branding. If your soul didn't feel joy, that was your fault. Maybe you hadn't repented properly. Maybe you were secretly prideful. Or maybe, and this was the nuclear option, you were letting Satan win. And God forbid you actually expressed your sorrow. Then you weren't just pitiful, you were contagious. Sadness could spread like emotional mildew, and monasteries hated mildew. Lay people weren't immune either. If you couldn't muster joy while plowing fields or spinning wool, it wasn't because you were exhausted or grieving. No, you needed to go to confession and maybe build a shed out of guilt to atone. The irony? Some monks' writings about battling acia sound eerily modern. Descriptions of numbness, fatigue, restlessness, even suicidal ideation. But instead of therapy, they got alphabetized sin lists and hunger-induced hallucinations. You'd think that in an era when most people owned 2 shirts and one was flea-infested, laughter would be encouraged. A little joy to survive the plague-ridden, mud-spattered, leech-happy nightmare of daily life? Think again. In medieval Europe, laughter wasn't always a sign of happiness. It was a moral red flag. Sure, peasants laughed. Jesters laughed. Even monks occasionally cracked a smile if a goose did something particularly ridiculous. But according to theologians, chroniclers, and other very serious people, laughter could be dangerous, a gateway to chaos, sin, and gasp, dancing. The Church, ever vigilant against human enjoyment, warned against excessive mirth. Thomas Aquinas, whose sense of humor was reportedly filed under to be developed, argued laughter should be moderate and serve a higher purpose. Uncontrolled giggling? A sign of spiritual disorder, possibly even demonic influence. After all, who laughs without reason? Answer: people with fully functional souls. Women faced double standards. A laughing woman was clearly scheming. Witchcraft, probably. A somber, silent woman was appropriately pious or just severely dehydrated. And the laughter of the mentally ill? If someone cackled during a funeral or snorted while milking a goat, it wasn't seen as eccentric. It was evidence of madness, possession, or both. Involuntary laughter was basically a red flag with jingle bells attached. Some religious orders banned novices from laughing during meals, prayer, or any activity that might spark human connection. Joy was fine in theory, but only the solemn, God-fearing kind, not the belly-aching, wine-snorting kind you get when someone slips on a turnip. Still, people did laugh. Humor survived in village festivals, satirical poems, and that one guy in every town who could fart on command. But it was always risky. Joy was tolerated, never trusted. Talking to your cat is quirky today. In the Middle Ages, potentially heretical. Medieval society had very clear rules about who you could converse with. People, fine. Priests, better. Animals/invisible beings, alarming. Pets were already suspicious. They killed pests but never went to church. If you confided in your tabby too often, people assumed she was your familiar, a demonic pet sent to whisper forbidden knowledge, like where your neighbor hid his cheese. Birds were sketchy too. Medieval bestiaries claimed crows could predict death, so if you said a raven told you the future, that wasn't poetic. It was treason against sanity. Even dogs, man's loyal companions, were only acceptable until they started appearing in your dreams wearing robes and quoting scripture. Then there were angels, ubiquitous in religious texts but very risky to claim as pen pals. If you said you heard/saw them. In a monastery, saintly. Yelling at clouds in the town square, probably a witch. And imaginary friends? Children got a pass. Adults? You were either a prophet, a lunatic, or future firewood. Some mystics, like Hildegard of Bingen, got away with divine visions because they were educated, cloistered, and intimidating. But if you were Bertram the peasant debating theology with squirrels? Yeah, no illuminated manuscripts for you. Mental illness in the medieval world teetered between two extremes. You were either a walking curiosity or a shameful family secret, and often both depending on whether the village market was open that day. Let's start with public spectacle. If someone with visible mental illness wandered through town muttering, dancing in the rain, or arguing passionately with a bucket, they might draw crowds, not condemnation. In fact, they could become fixtures of local life, like the church bell tower or that one three-legged chicken everyone knew. People would gawk, whisper, maybe even laugh. Not always cruelly, though sometimes, but with that peculiar medieval blend of amusement and fear, because deep down, everyone wondered, could that be me next week if I take a bad fall or eat spoiled eel pie? In some places, these individuals were called natural fools, a term that sounds insulting but carried weird affection by medieval standards. They were seen as innocent, almost childlike, sometimes even touched by God. You might get food, shelter, and a nickname like Tom O'Bedlam or Mad Maggie. It wasn't ideal care, but in a world without therapy, it beat being chained in a dungeon. But for families, mental illness was rarely charming. If a relative was quietly struggling, maybe depressed, withdrawn, or plagued by what we'd now call anxiety, it became a private burden, which in medieval terms meant don't talk about it ever. Shame was social currency, and a troubled mind could stain an entire bloodline. Some families hid afflicted members in back rooms. Others shipped them off to monasteries or sent them on pilgrimages, hoping divine geography would succeed where herbal teas had failed. In sadder cases, people were disowned entirely, especially if they became disruptive or, worst of all, embarrassing at weddings. Public mental health care barely existed. Shame filled the gaps where compassion should have been. No clinics, no outreach, just whispered prayers and performative normality. By the late Middle Ages, around the 15th century, give or take a plague or three, things began shifting, not quickly, not gracefully, but with faint glimmers of progress. For starters, philosophy and science started creeping into the conversation. Thanks to Arabic medical texts translated in places like Spain and Sicily, Europe rediscovered ancient Greek thinkers who, while no psychiatrists, at least considered the mind more than just a demon's chew toy. Scholars tentatively suggested madness might stem from bodily imbalances, not just sin or sorcery. Physicians wrote treatises discussing melancholy and mania with slightly fewer Bible quotes and slightly more anatomy. Don't get too excited, treatments still involve things like apply leeches to the temples, but it was a start. Simultaneously, charitable care evolved. Cities like Valencia and Cairo established early hospitals that separated mental disturbances from general wards. Some even offered gardens, music, and shockingly, conversation. It was still far from humane. Think more lightly supervised garden time than therapy, but beats being chained to a church wall while priests yelled psalms at you. The printing press helped too. As books spread, so did ideas about the mind. This planted seeds for the Renaissance, when mental illness began its slow crawl from you're cursed to you might need help. Of course, not everything changed. Fear of the unknown persisted, and the line between madness and mysticism stayed as thin as a nun's patience. But the foundation was laid. Slowly, the mentally ill were no longer seen solely as vessels of sin or divine wrath, but as people, fallible, suffering, worthy of care. Though hugs would have to wait another few centuries. Noble life looked divine from the outside, perfumed corridors, gem-encrusted gowns, servants anticipating every whim. Whether at Versailles or Kyoto's imperial court, nobles projected perfection frozen in time, like gilded portraits. But behind the powdered wigs and porcelain smiles, a suffocating reality. For many nobles, this life of luxury felt less like paradise and more like a velvet-lined prison. Every detail, from waking hours to napkin folding techniques, was dictated by unwritten codes. In France, nobles performed the lever ritual each morning, lining up to watch the king rise from bed like some bizarre celestial event. Skip it? Rumors spread. Influence crumbled. Enemies smiled. At Versailles, losing social capital was deadlier than losing money. In Japan's imperial court, nobles mastered poetry and calligraphy while every bow, sleeve flick, and silence became political theater. A poorly timed verse could mean social suicide. Even leisure was performative. A garden stroll might hide a battlefield of veiled insults. You weren't living. You were starring in an endless play where the audience was everyone and the stakes were your legacy. And escaping? Nearly impossible. Inheritance laws, arranged marriages, and constant surveillance chained nobles to their gilded cages. Behind closed doors, many crumbled. Mental decline, quiet rebellion, or spiritual despair. But in public, they smiled. Always smiled. The cruel paradox of nobility: the higher your status, the less freedom you had. Behind all the silk and splendor, a surprising number of nobles were drowning in debt collectors. Turns out, maintaining the illusion of wealth was more expensive than actual wealth itself. At Versailles, appearances were everything. A noble might spend more on a single embroidered waistcoat than maintaining an entire estate. Why? Because fashion was survival. Fall behind in sartorial politics, and you'd vanish socially, politically, financially. Courtiers gambled staggering sums, not just at cards, but on horses, land schemes, and high-stakes alliances. Many mortgaged ancestral homes just to fund one more season of relevance. And the king? Louis XIV deliberately kept nobles financially dependent, encouraging outrageous spending to ensure they remained distracted, indebted, and loyal. In England, Georgian-era aristocrats lived in opulent London townhouses, entirely on credit. Tailors, winemakers, and milliners waited months, sometimes years, for payment. Entire families balanced on bankruptcy's edge, praying their daughters would marry richer men or that distant cousins would die conveniently. Over in Russia, nobles owned vast serf-staffed estates yet were often cash poor. Their wealth was trapped in land. Lavish Moscow lifestyles required constant borrowing. Pawn shops discreetly traded tiaras for coins. Family jewels were sold by candlelight. Even Japan's nobility struggled during the Tokugawa peace. As samurai shifted from warriors to bureaucrats, many nobles became ceremonial figureheads. Stipends shrank while costs ballooned. Some took side jobs, actual jobs, teaching poetry or managing estates to keep up appearances. The tragic lesson? Nobility wasn't about financial security. It was about performing wealth, a masquerade that often came at soul-crushing cost. Scandal was the unofficial second language of nobility. Affairs, stolen jewels, secret children, whispered betrayals. The more polished the public image, the filthier the private truths. At Versailles, privacy barely existed, yet illicit affairs flourished. Marie Antoinette faced endless rumors, many false, about liaisons with Swedish counts and ladies-in-waiting. The court thrived on gossip. Scandal wasn't just tolerated, it was currency. Your name in the wrong bedroom could make or break dynasties. In England, reputations died in gambling dens. Lord Byron was rumored to have fathered a child with his half-sister, which didn't stop his celebrity but haunted his nobility. Affairs with actresses? Expected. With foreign spies? Exile-worthy. Imperial Russia under Catherine the Great was worse. Her court mixed politics and pillow talk openly. Lovers were installed as generals, betrayals settled with poison. Even in Kyoto's refined halls, poetry masked midnight trysts. A single ambiguous verse could ignite wildfire rumors. But the real dangerous scandals? Those never made diaries. Treasonous letters in cipher, assassination plots buried in family archives. Because in noble life, scandal wasn't the exception. It was the wallpaper, beautiful, intricate, and always hiding cracks. For all their earthly power, nobles often wrestled with spiritual terror. They had everything except certainty about the afterlife. In Catholic France, guilt clung to palace walls like perfume. Nobles attended mass by day, debauched by night. Confession became performance art. Yet many, especially aging ones, were haunted. Some consulted mystics, others funded churches like celestial insurance policies. Even the Sun King grew devout, terrified as wars and indulgences doomed him. Orthodox Russia was fiercer. Nobles balanced political duty with spiritual panic under tsars who claimed divine mandate while ordering massacres. Some sought solace in underground prayer circles, or holy fools mad wanderers believed to speak God's truth. In feudal Japan, samurai nobles agonized over Buddhist detachment versus Confucian duty. Some turned to Zen, others wrote poetry screaming with existential dread. When all failed, seppuku became spiritual release. Behind the gold and titles, souls screaming into the void. In the age before smartphones and encrypted emails, the most dangerous weapon a noble could wield wasn't a dagger, it was a letter. Ink on parchment could topple dynasties, expose affairs, or spark revolutions. And nobles, despite their polished exteriors, were compulsive correspondents. They documented everything: secrets, longing, schemes, prayers, love, lies. At Versailles, every noble had a paper trail. Love letters to mistresses, often in code. Pleading notes to creditors. Flattery-soaked memos to the king. Nothing was truly private. Couriers carried messages sealed with invisible ink or ciphers. A single misphrased sentence could mean exile or the executioner's block. Some nobles invented personal alphabets just for clandestine chats. The Duke of Orleans famously corresponded with radicals before the French Revolution using an elaborate cipher. But codes weren't foolproof. One noble's encrypted diary was cracked posthumously, revealing treasonous plots. Meanwhile, in Habsburg courts, marriage negotiations hid between lines about weather and falconry. A letter might begin with small talk before casually mentioning a political assassination. Japanese nobles used 31-syllable poems as covert messaging. A woman's verse could signal forbidden love or rejection, delivered by innocent servants sworn to secrecy. During the Renaissance, noble women like Isabella d'Este ran spy networks through salon letters. And the riskiest letters? Those that never arrived, intercepted, burned, or hidden in wall crevices for centuries. Some held revolutions. Others contained heartbreaking last words. All proved one truth: in gilded cages, words were both shackles and lockpicks. In noble society, emotions were contraband. Joy, anger, grief, all had to be measured, concealed, or performatively staged. Survival depended not on wealth or title, but on mastering the art of emotional alchemy. At Versailles, life was perpetual theater. Nobles rehearsed smiles, calibrated bows, weaponized silence. A raised eyebrow could signal alliance or sabotage. Tears were reserved for funerals, and even then, only if the audience approved. Children learned young. Speak only when addressed, show pride without arrogance, swallow grief until it could bleed into diaries. In Japan's imperial court, restraint was an exact science. Public emotion was vulgar. True feelings lived in the way a sleeve brushed the floor, a fan opened halfway, a single cherry blossom plucked too soon. Meanwhile, English nobles perfected the stiff upper lip. Scandals were drowned in brandy, never discussed. Journals became secret vaults for suppressed rage and despair. When nobles cracked, mid-ball or during ceremonies, they vanished, confined to asylums or recuperating at remote estates. But the show went on, because in this grand masquerade, emotions were liabilities, and every smile was a calculated risk. To be born noble was to inherit expectations heavier than crowns. From infancy, you weren't a person. You were a vessel for legacy, every choice haunted by ancestors and unborn heirs. In France, ducal sons were groomed like racehorses. Marry this heiress. Befriend the prince. Don't disgrace 300 years of breeding. Women fared worse, their worth measured in dowry weight and bloodline purity. England's aristocracy operated similarly. Firstborn sons inherited estates and crushing debts. Younger sons were dumped into the clergy or military. Daughters? Walking treaty agreements in silk. In Russia, noble families lived on a knife's edge. One misstep could see lands, serfs, even names erased by czarist decree. Centuries of work gone with one signature. And rebels? Those who refused arranged marriages or titles. They were rarely heroic. Most were crushed by the juggernaut of tradition. The bitter truth: nobility meant being chained to history, whether you wanted it or not. Not all nobles followed the script. Beneath layers of etiquette and centuries of expectation, some cracked and others rebelled. But noble defiance was rarely dramatic. No peasant uprisings here. just quiet acts of subversion tucked into palace corners, hidden behind locked doors, or disguised as tradition itself. At Versailles, where conformity reigned supreme, rebellion wore strange disguises. Skipping the king's morning lever ritual, a shocking act of independence. Wearing unfashionable colors, the 18th century equivalent of dyeing your hair blue. Marrying for love instead of alliance, the ultimate middle finger to dynasty. These small gestures were political earthquakes. When the Duc de Lauzun publicly courted Louis XIV's cousin, the Sun King threw him in prison for a decade. Because in Versailles, true love was treason. Over in England, some aristocrats flipped the script entirely. Lord Byron didn't just write poetry, he lived his rebellion. Traveling Europe with a pet bear, allegedly drinking wine from a skull cup, calling Parliament a collection of well-dressed sheep. Less flamboyant nobles simply vanished to their country estates, refusing to play London's social games. In an era when attendance at court meant power, their absence screamed, "I quit." Russian nobles took riskier paths. Some secretly funded revolutionary cells disguised as poetry salons. Others educated their serfs, a crime punishable by Siberian exile under the Tsars. Their quiet betrayals of the system were like termites gnawing at a gilded throne. Even in Japan's rigid hierarchy, rebellion found cracks. A noblewoman accidentally burning her arranged marriage contract. A samurai adopting tea ceremony as spiritual protest. Deliberately miswriting a poem to insult a superior. These weren't grand gestures. But in societies where every bow and comma carried meaning, such acts were Molotov cocktails wrapped in silk. For all their posturing about legacy, nobles were obsessed with one thing above all, being remembered. Not the organic kind of memory, the chiseled in marble, portrait in every hall, eternal kind. The brutal truth? Most weren't. Sure, we recall the big names, the Henry VIIIs, the Catherine the Greats. But the average countess or minor duke? Gone. Their elaborate rituals, feuds, and jeweled shoes vanished like breath on a mirror. In France, the revolution didn't just kill nobles, it erased them. Portraits were slashed. Names were outlawed. Those who survived by fleeing or hiding became cautionary tales, not legends. England's aristocracy fared better, yet how many Georgian lords can you name? Their grand estates now sit crumbling, their tapestries moth-eaten. A title without heirs is a legacy without oxygen. Even Japan's imperial nobility faded. The once powerful court ranks became ceremonial props as samurai rose. Today, their poetry collections gather dust in museum cases. And those who tried hardest to control their narrative? The ones commissioning flattering biographies and building monuments? History cherry-picked them too. The real stories, the shame, the secrets survive only in footnotes and fragmented letters. In the end, legacy was the ultimate illusion. Nobles lived to be remembered, yet were often forgotten completely. Behind the gold leaf portraits? A simple truth. Permanence was never real, only the performance was. By the 15th century, Europe's approach to mental illness began its slow crawl from superstition toward observation, though treatment remained a brutal lottery. Three emerging practices revealed both progress and persistent cruelty. 1. The rise of Bedlam and its horrors. London's Bethlehem Hospital, nicknamed Bedlam, became Europe's most infamous asylum. Originally a monastery, by 1403 it housed the mad, under conditions that would make a dungeon seem humane. Patients chained naked to walls in freezing halls. Therapies included rotating cages and ice baths. Wealthy visitors paid to gawk at inmates like zoo animals. Yet even here, glimmers of change appeared. Some physicians began documenting cases with clinical detail, noting how the melancholic stares at walls, while the frenzied bite their chains. 2. The medicalization of madness. Arab medical texts, translated in Spain, introduced new ideas. Melancholy as a brain imbalance, not demonic. Epilepsy as a physical condition, not divine punishment. European doctors tentatively adopted these views, though their cures still involved draining black bile via leeches or trepanning, drilling skull holes to release evil vapors. 3. The persistence of folk healing. In villages, cunning folk still dominated mental health care with herbal sedatives, opium poppy, henbane, ritual baths with hallucinogenic plants. Talking cures disguised as spell removal. A 1489 woodcut shows a healer whispering to a depressed farmer. The worm in your heart can be sung out. Modern analysis suggests these rituals provided placebo effect and community support, often more effective than church exorcisms. The Great Paradox: chains versus compassion. Records show contradictory approaches coexisting. In Florence, the Ospedale degli Innocenti, 1419, had rooftop gardens for melancholics, yet also used shackles. In Ghent, a 1456 ordinance required the mad to be kept from harm, while allowing their families to display them for alms. Most telling? The emergence of fools' licenses, certificates protecting harmless madmen from persecution, proving society was wrestling with moral responsibility toward the ill. The shadow of the witch hunts. As medieval Europe ended, a new terror emerged: mass hysteria about witchcraft. Symptoms like delusions, numbness, fits, once treated with herbs, now meant burning at the stake. A 1486 manual, Malleus Maleficarum, pathologized female descent as satanic, leading to midwives being targeted. Their knowledge of herbs equals witchcraft. Elderly women confessing to demonic pacts under torture. Mental illness increasingly framed as moral failure. This dark turn would haunt Europe for centuries, proving that progress in mental health care was never linear and always at risk of being swallowed by new fears. As the Middle Ages waned, Europe's approach to mental health took a dark bureaucratic turn. What began as monastic charity hardened into systemic confinement, transforming the divinely touched into societal problems needing management. 1. The birth of the madhouse, 1400 to 1600. Municipal governments began replacing monastery cells with dedicated asylums, mixing medieval superstitions with Renaissance bureaucracy. London's bedlams started charging admission in 1598, tuppence to laugh at chained inmates. Paris Hospital General, 1656, locked up the mad with beggars and prostitutes. Venice's Sancervolo used therapeutic drownings in icy lagoon water. Records show keepers inventing diagnoses like dancing mania for those moving rhythmically, moonstruck lethargy for depression. 2. Medical theater replaces miracles. Doctors staged elaborate treatments for paying audiences. The spinning chair, whirling patients until they vomited bad humors. Fear shock therapy, dropping melancholics into snake pits. Blood music, playing instruments during bleedings to calm the spirits. A 1583 physician's journal boasts, "We cured a lunatic by lowering him into a well for 3 days. The demons fled from the damp." 3. The paperwork of madness. As record-keeping improved, so did institutional dehumanization. Leiden Asylum's 1556 ledger lists patients as item number 12. One raving man eats his own filth. Spanish Inquisition files reclassified visions as demonic, burn, or holy, keep, based on political convenience. Yet buried in these cruel systems flickered unexpected compassion. A Nuremberg doctor prescribing kind words and wine for grief, 1521. Belgian nuns secretly teaching basket weaving to distract from voices. The Great Confinement, 17th century onward. By 1600, Europe's attitude crystallized into 3 brutal principles. Out of sight, madness became urban pollution. Paris expelled 10% of its poor to rural workhouses by 1650. Many simply people with epilepsy or dementia. One size fits all. The same iron collar restraint. A depressed widow. A shell-shocked soldier. A syphilitic aristocrat. Profit over care. Asylums became family businesses. The Bethlehem dynasty ran bedlam for 200 years, pocketing patient labor profits while feeding them rotten gruel. Legacy of the transition period. This era bequeathed psychiatry both its worst habits and first glimmers of humanity. The bad. The restraint obsession lasting into 20th century straitjackets. Diagnostic laziness. All odd behaviors equals mania. The good. Early attempts at occupational therapy, weaving, gardening. Recognizing environmental causes. A 1628 text links madness to lead poisoning. Most importantly, it marked the moment Western society stopped blaming the moon or demons and started blaming the mind itself. A conceptual leap that would eventually lead to modern medicine, but first had to pass through centuries of darkness. By the 18th century, Europe's asylums had become monuments of horror, but from their shadows emerged the first reformers daring to suggest madness might deserve compassion, not chains. 1. The Age of Moral Treatment, 1750 to 1820. A radical new philosophy took root, that mental illness might respond to kindness and routine rather than brutality. Pioneers like Philippe Pinel, Paris, 1793, struck off the chains at Bicester Asylum, introduced sunlit rooms and staff-patient conversations. His 1801 medical philosophical treatise argued, "The mad are not wild beasts, but sick citizens." William Tuke, York, 1796, founded the Retreat, a Quaker asylum with gardens and tea parties. Proved patients improved when treated as guests rather than prisoners. Yet resistance was fierce. A London doctor sneered in 1811. Tuke coddles lunatics as if they were delicate children. Next he'll serve them cake. 2. The dark countercurrents. Even as reform spread, old horrors persisted. Benjamin Rush's Tranquilizer Chair, Philadelphia, 1810. Strapped patients in coffin-like devices for 72-hour immobilization. Marketed as humane because it replaced beatings. German water cures. Alternating scalding and freezing showers to shock the senses. 3. The diagnostic revolution. Early attempts to classify mental illness emerged, with mixed results. 1787. Drapetomania, a disease causing slaves to flee plantations. 1810. Nostalgia, pathologized homesickness in soldiers. 1822. First crude separation of depression from psychosis. A Parisian nurse's 1799 diary captures the transition. "Today we took group 3 to pick apples instead of bloodletting. They smiled. Tomorrow, the doctors may overrule us." The birth of modern psychiatry, 1820 to 1850. 3 key developments shifted the paradigm. The asylum building boom. Government-funded hospitals promised healing through architecture. Circular wards for calming the humors. Farm labor as therapy. Segregation by gender, often worsening abuse. Medicalization of madness. Terms like neurosis and mental hygiene entered vocabularies. First psychiatric journals debated. Biological causes versus moral failings. The ethics of restraints. The rise of alienists. Early psychiatrists positioned themselves as explorers of inner frontiers, mapping the dark continents of the mind. Developing talk therapies, pre-Freud, clashing with clergy over demonic possession claims. A patient's 1837 letter from Edinburgh Asylum reveals both progress and pain. "They no longer whip us, but the soothing baths feel like drowning." Legacy of the Reform era. This period bequeathed psychiatry its foundational tensions. The good, recognition of trauma as a cause, war veterans, soldiers' heart. Early advocacy for patient rights. Occupational therapy standards. The bad, new pseudoscientific abuses, phrenology, racial degeneracy theories. Institutional overconfidence. We can cure all with this one method. Most importantly, it marked the moment Western medicine finally accepted. Madness was neither sin nor supernatural, but a medical challenge to be met with both science and humanity. The road ahead remained long, electroshock, lobotomies, but the chains, literal and metaphorical, had begun to break. Returning to the medieval world, we find mental health understood through a prism of humors, heavenly signs, and spiritual warfare, where a melancholic sigh could mark you as either a philosopher or a heretic. The boundaries between medicine, magic, and religion blurred into a tapestry of fear and occasional compassion. 1. The humoral prison. Every medieval person existed in perpetual imbalance, their moods dictated by swirling bodily fluids they could neither see nor control. Spring's danger. As snow melted, hot moist, blood was thought to cause reckless behavior. Youths brawling, maidens eloping. Monastic records show March confessions spiking for lustful thoughts. Winter's black bile. The cold, dry season brought waves of what we'd call seasonal depression. A 14th century English widow's diary. The dark eats my soul like stale bread. Physicians prescribed countermeasures as crude as they were logical. To cool summer madness, bathe in moonlight and eat cold cucumbers. For winter gloom, drink wine steeped with hot spices and badger fat. 2. The sky's tyranny. Celestial bodies govern minds as absolutely as kings ruled lands. Full moon crises. Village constables prepared for monthly unrest. Midwives kept birthing stools ready. Moon-touched, babies were thought prone to madness. Planetary alignments. A 1378 Parisian doctor's notes. Saturn's gaze hardens the melancholic's bowels. Treat with warm enemas and harp music. Even animals weren't spared this cosmic determinism. Farmers swore pigs farrowed under Mars went mad by autumn, their flesh unfit for eating. 3. The Church's double-edged comfort. For all its fire and brimstone, Christianity offered something revolutionary. The possibility of redemption through suffering. Demon or saint. A woman hearing voices might be possessed if she screamed obscenities, blessed if she quoted psalms. The difference often lay in the local priest's digestion that day. Pilgrimage as therapy. The road to Canterbury or Compostela became Europe's first group therapy. Cripples, depressives, and soul-weary nobles walked side by side. A 12th century monk observed, "The mad find peace in rhythm, their feet on the road, their mouths chanting Ave Marias." The village compromise. Outside courts and cloisters, ordinary folk developed pragmatic approaches. 1. The wise woman's balance. Herb wives blended. Practical care, sleep drafts of poppy and honey. Ritual theater, burning rosemary to scare dark humors. Gossip as catharsis, listening to marital woes while grinding herbs. 2. The holy fool's sanctuary. Some communities embraced their mad as living talismans. The Yorkshire village that left oats for Wild Tom, who spoke in rhymes. Venetian fishermen who took moon-mad Luca aboard for good luck. 3. Family shame and secret kindness. Households developed dual strategies. Public pretense, locking unstable relatives in retreat rooms. Private tenderness, a mother sneaking honey cakes to her fey child. A stained glass window in Chartres Cathedral captures this paradox, depicting a demoniac writhing at Christ's feet while a merchant's wife discreetly wipes the froth from his lips. Shadows lengthening toward modernity. By the late Middle Ages, cracks appeared in the old frameworks. Medical texts began separating melancholy from sin. Courts occasionally spared mad criminals from execution. Herbalists traded recipes from Moorish Spain to Norse fjords. Yet for all these glimmers, treatment remained a lottery. One could be bled, blessed, or burned based on the day's whims. As a 15th century Florentine merchant scrawled in his account book, "God makes men mad, but only gold determines whether they're healed or hanged." The echoes of medieval mental health care still reverberate through our modern systems, like whispers in a cathedral vault, sometimes faint, sometimes startlingly clear. What we dismiss as archaic often persists in disguised forms, revealing how deeply these ancient frameworks shaped our understanding of the mind. 1. Language of lunacy. Our vocabulary remains haunted by medieval concepts. Lunatic, from Luna, the moon's influence. Melancholy, black bile's legacy. Hysterical, the wandering womb's ghost. A 21st century psychiatrist's prescription pad might read SSRI for melancholia, unwittingly echoing Galen's diagnosis from 1800 years prior. 2. Institutional inheritances. The architecture of confinement evolved, but never fully escaped its roots. Monastic cells, asylum wards, psychiatric hospitals. Pilgrimage routes, therapeutic communities. Village wise women psychiatric nurses. The 15th century chain funds, charity for restraining the mad, find their parallel in modern restraints and seclusion rooms. 3. The eternal blame game. Medieval society's dual impulses, to sanctify or stigmatize, still battle within us. Then, demons versus divine visions. Now, chemical imbalance versus personal weakness. A depressed nobleman praying before St. Dymphna's shrine and a modern teen Googling, "Do I have ADHD?" share the same fundamental question. Is this me, or something happening to me? Medieval wisdom we ignore at our peril. For all its cruelties, the Middle Ages grasped truths our clinical age forgets. 1. Community is medicine, where we isolate patients in waiting rooms, villages provided. Shared rituals, harvest festivals calming seasonal depression. Integrated care, the blacksmith, priest, and herb wife collaborating. Purposeful work, weaving, farming as tangible therapy. 2. The poetry of madness. Modern DSM diagnoses flatten experience, while medieval culture allowed for holy folly's sacred ambiguity. Troubadour melancholia as romantic ideal. Visionaries like Hildegard of Bingen turning psychosis into theology. 3. Humoral harmony. The four humors were wrong, but their holistic view anticipated. Gut-brain axis research. Seasonal effective light therapy. Personalized medicine's return. A Cambridge neuroscientist 2023 study on inflammatory depression reads remarkably like a 1390 monastic medical text. The unbroken chain. From bloodletting to SSRIs, from exorcisms to EMDR, humanity's journey to understand the mind remains a story of desperation and discovery, cruelty and compassion, arrogance and humility. As we stand before our own diagnostic labyrinths and pharmaceutical minotaurs, we might ponder, have we truly escaped medieval thinking, or simply exchanged leeches for prescription pads and demonology for neurochemistry? The medieval madman singing to the moon and the modern depressive scrolling through midnight TikTok both live in worlds that simultaneously medicalize and mystify suffering. Perhaps the greatest lesson lies in a 13th century stained glass fragment from Chartres, showing a demoniac and a saint sharing the same face, reminding us then as now that madness and meaning are never more than a thought apart. The medieval approach to mental health persists in our hospitals and homes more than we dare admit, not in leeches or exorcisms, but in the unexamined architectures of care we've inherited. Walk through any modern psychiatric ward with 15th century eyes, and the ghosts of Bedlam whisper from the walls. 1. The new humorism. Our biomedical model has become a 4-neurotransmitter theory as rigid as Galen's fluids. Serotonin, the new blood. Dopamine, yellow bile's air. GABA, phlegmatic calm. Glutamate, black bile's modern twin. A pharmaceutical rep's 2023 pitch. This SSRI rebalances your chemical humors. The language sanitized, the metaphor unchanged. 2. Digital astrology. We've swapped star charts for algorithmic predictions. Moon phases sleep tracker data. Natal charts genetic risk profiles. Mars in retrograde. Serotonin transporter polymorphism. The medieval peasant blaming bad crops on planetary alignment and the modern worker attributing burnout to bad brain chemistry share the same cognitive comfort. Mystery made manageable. 3. The secular exorcism. Our rituals of purification evolved but kept their shape. Confession therapy sessions. Fasting cleanses. Pilgrimage wellness retreats. Even the medieval demon language persists. A 2024 study on gut microbiota is titled, "The Microbiome, Possessing Our Emotions?" Medieval Shadows in the Light of Science. 1. The rebirth of community care. Surprisingly, our most advanced treatments are returning to medieval models. Clubhouse International, psychosocial rehab centers, mirror monastic ghost houses. Peer support specialists recast the village wise woman role. Animal-assisted therapy echoes the medieval fool's companion tradition. A NYC social worker notes, "My schizophrenic clients stabilize fastest when we get them gardening, exactly like those medieval herb gardens." 2. The new wandering womb. Gender biases simply changed costumes. 1900s, hysteria from unfulfilled wombs. 2020s, estrogen dominance causing anxiety. Medieval, witchcraft accusations. Modern, borderline personality labels. The 14th century witch's mark and today's treatment-resistant depression diagnosis serves similar social functions, marking the unmanageable for special handling. 3. The return of the moon. Cutting-edge research now validates what folk wisdom knew. Lunar cycles affecting bipolar episodes. 2023 Johns Hopkins study. Seasonal rhythms in serotonin transmission. Circadian disruption mimicking melancholia. The medieval lunatic may get the last laugh after all. Building the future with medieval tools. Perhaps the way forward isn't rejecting these ancient frameworks, but redeeming them. Sacred spaces. Replace sterile clinics with healing gardens like monastery infirmaries. Integrated care. Bring back the village model. GPs working with social workers and artists. Ritual reimagined. Update pilgrimages as structured community reintegration. As a psychiatric resident recently confessed, we're discovering that the best parts of our evidence-based practice were what medieval caregivers did instinctively. The medieval world understood something we're relearning at great cost. Mental health cannot be divorced from meaning, community, and the body's rhythms. Their methods were often brutal, their insights frequently accidental, but their holistic vision might be precisely what our fractured modern system lacks. In the end, we're all still that 13th century peasant, standing in the rain, wondering if our sadness comes from stars, sins, or something in between. The questions haven't changed, only our tools for answering them.